permitted to leave this witness, so we will not go where we don't want to go.
Okay. Get the jury to come back.
Your Honor, before you bring the jury back in,
Take a while to get here.
I would ask for, when we get around these, dance around these issues, that I be permitted to leave this witness, so we will not go where we don't want to go.
Okay. We'll see how you do that, and we'll see if there's an objection. And I'll rule if there is.
Is present, Your Honor.
Very good. The motion is denied. You may proceed.
While you were in Mr. Ayler's office that morning, did Mr. Ayler have to go anywhere?
He did. He
What did
said
he
that he
have?
had an appointment.
Okay. And when were you supposed to return to his office?
We plan to return at 6 o'clock that evening to get a statement,
What kind of statement?
a written statement.
And who was to prepare that statement?
Mr. Slager and his attorney.
Now, I believe y'all returned earlier than that, correct?
We did.
Why was that?
We got information that the Scott family planned to release video of the shooting to the media. So we wanted to have an opportunity to show Mr. Slager and his attorney the video and get his response and what happened.
And what time did you return to Mr. Ayler's office?
I believe it was around 4 o'clock.
Was he once again advised of his rights?
He was.
And was the video shown?
It was.
Now, during a break, did Lieutenant Gint receive a call from someone?
He did.
And based upon this call received by Lieutenant Gint, what did y'all do?
We arrested Mr. Slager
And that occurred at around what time?
around 5 o'clock.
Now, as part of your investigation, did you check Mr. Scott's record or to determine if there was any outstanding warrants on him?
Yes.
And what did you discover?
There was a warrant for child support, outstanding child support, that was active.
And during your investigation, did you obtain a copy
Yes.
of the warrant?
I hand you what's been marked as state's number 224.
During your investigation, did you have the occasion to obtain the cell phone records from the victim, Walter Scott?
I did.
Do you recall when you obtained those records?
Around May 11th,
Of what year?
2015.
And what did you learn from reviewing those records?
Different people that he spoke to the morning of the incident, in particular his mother.
What did you learn about, what did you learn with regard to his mother?
That he spoke to her, I believe it was from he had an open call with her from approximately 9:36 that morning to 9:57 that morning.
Judge, I believe this is already in there. This information.
Any objection?
It's in evidence. It's on records from that point.
All right, and your response?
We would operate as a compilation of data of the 1006, I believe.
Is the same document as in evidence or something different about that one?
No, Your Honor, this is basically, what this is it shows the calls to and from Mr. Scott from
All right.
quarter after on midnight the day up to 9:36 that morning. The only difference between this and the phone records that are already in evidence is that the actual identity of the caller by name is added in a column. May I approach, Your Honor? Added in a column on the far right hand, which was determined by virtue of the number, the phone number called or received. So all of the
Whose
columns,
compilation is this?
this is Agent Peterson's. And in answer to the question, the only difference is that last copy from the records that already.
Is this something you're attempting to publish to the jury at this moment?
No, sir.
All right, it's marked for identification. I'll address it later. You may proceed.
Agent Peterson, I hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 247 for identification. And ask if you can explain to the judge what that is.
It's basically shows the calls that were incoming and outgoing during that morning on Walter Scott's phone on April 4th, 2015.
Now, the phone records that are in evidence, do they contain names of calls to and calls from?
They do not.
They just contain what? Is it what?
The phone numbers.
Okay. And how did you arrive at the names on that far right-hand column on that?
I believe these parties testified to their number and provided their number.
During their direct testimony?
Correct.
Moving on to September the 8th of 2015, did you make arrangements to have the taser in this case, State's Exhibit number 49, sent to Brian Childs at Taser International?
I did.
I believe I said that leaving on September 8th of 2015, did you make arrangements to have the taser in this case, State's Exhibit number 49, sent to Brian Childs at Taser International? And did you answer the question?
I did,
Okay.
yes.
For what purpose?
There was some, first of all, to get some insight on the taser and the whole mechanics of it and what occurred that day. And there was cited by Agent John Hyatt, who initially ran the download of the taser, which shows the trigger activations for the day and the times. There was found to be a time drift. And me not being an expert in that field, needed to find somebody that could explain that. So we contacted Taser International in an attempt to get the explanation of what occurred that day and an explanation of how a time drift occurs. And basically that's because the taser hadn't been synced.
Agent Peterson, as part of your investigation, did you come into possession of items that had been removed from the Mercedes in this case, the gray Mercedes that had been driven by Mr. Scott?
I did.
And could you tell us whether or not the contents of that Mercedes contained a registration card and insurance card?
It did.
I hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 248 and for identification, and ask if you recognize the documents in that.
It's the registration and plate decal sticker and insurance card for Arthur Hayward for the Mercedes.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time we would offer State's 248.
Submitted.
Could you please answer the question, Mr. Patterson?
Yes.
Good afternoon, Agent Peterson.
Good afternoon.
As I understand it, you've been in law enforcement for basically your whole career, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in that capacity, you work with Mount Pleasant Police Department in Richmond, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And while you were with Mount Pleasant, you had experience with the federal government in different facets, terrorism, anti-terrorism, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
and also on major drug cases investigated by federal law enforcement.
Yes, sir.
And this is your first case involving a homicide as the case agent, is that correct?
I need to correct on the record. I have been assigned a case agent to a homicide case prior to this.
Okay, well, you previously testified under oath that this was your first homicide case in which you acted as the case agent. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And as the case agent, and listening to your testimony today and the testimony of others, does that mean you're in charge of the investigation, or does that mean you're in charge of just certain parts of the investigation?
It can depend. It depends upon supervisor's involvement. It depends upon if you are working it with another case agent. So I can't give you an exact answer on how that would always occur.
Would it be fair to say that you make decisions that could be overruled, or maybe perhaps suggestions made by somebody higher up in the chain of command?
Yes, sir.
But the initial question on how to proceed would come under your authority, correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat
The
that?
initial decision on how to proceed in the case would come under your authority. You make the initial call, is that correct?
Not always. I may make a suggestion, and then it depends upon what the cumulative decision is that is made.
All right, well, let's talk about the training, if not the experience that you had prior to going into this. You have a long history of training with law enforcement at the Criminal Justice Academy, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you have any training for homicides?
I had it in June of 2015.
A more precise question. Prior to April 4th, 2015, had you had any academic training for investigations in homicides?
Not specific, but general, yes.
And a couple of months after this particular incident, you went to training for homicides.
Correct.
And that was at North Charleston Police Department.
Yes.
It wasn't at the Criminal Justice Academy.
It was not.
And as a result of that, did you adopt any new procedures and how to proceed in the case?
Of course, you learn a lot of different things. At that time, I was also conducting this investigation, so I wouldn't be able to give you a specific thing that I have adopted.
Following that academic training on investigations, did you go back and redo anything?
I'm sorry?
It's my understanding that on April 4th, 2015, despite some many years, 15, 16 years in law enforcement, is that correct?
Correct.
Experienced both Mount Pleasant and the federal government, that you had no training in homicide investigations. Is that a fair statement?
Specific, yes, but it gets covered generally in different classes in one way or another.
And then in June of 2015, a little over 2 months later, you had specific training in homicide investigations.
Correct.
As a result of the training you received in June, did you go back, look through your notes, and say, hey, I could do this better, I could do this differently, and make any changes?
I think that every day is a learning experience, that you can go back and do things differently. I don't have specific examples that I can give you in this case.
So, decisions that you made on April 4th, tell the jury, if you would, what the crime scene was that was investigated.
As far as what? Can you be more specific?
The incident involving Mr. Slager, Mr. Scott.
But what do you want to know about the crime scene?
What was the crime scene?
As far as geography, or?
If you would describe to the members of the jury what the crime scene was on April 4th, 2015.
There, as I previously said, the traffic stop occurred at the auto parts store off of Remount Road, right there at Craig Street. Then the driver of the vehicle, Walter Scott, ran down Craig Street, and then the struggle and altercation and taser deployments and firing of Mr. Slager's weapon occurred in the vacant lot behind Megapon.
And when you say, you describe that area, are you describing that area as being the crime scene?
It is, yes.
So all of Craig Road to the Yellow Brick Road was the crime scene, is that correct?
It is part of where they ran. The actual incident occurred in the vacant lot.
Well, the incident occurred on Remount and Craig Street, didn't it? Isn't that where it started?
The traffic stop, yes.
So was there any area from the traffic stop to Yellow Brick Road searched by you or searched by anybody under your direction?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
Craig and Remount to Yellow Brick Road, was any of that area searched by you or your colleagues?
I can't speak for sure upon if North Charleston searched that before or if we did. Our primary focus was in the vacant lot.
In the vacant lot, as I understood someone's testimony, it's enclosed by a fence, is that correct?
There's a fence, partial fence, yes.
And when you say a partial fence, would you tell the jury what that means?
There's fence on the right side, fence on the left side, there's some fence on the front of it, and then there is some in the back, but there's an opening at the back and an opening at the front.
Would it be a fair statement to say that the entire lot was enclosed by a fence, except for those areas where the Yellow Brick Road came in and went out?
To not be exact with a measurement there and being able to actually say that it was actually right at the line in general, yes, that would be a fair statement, but to be precise and exact, I could not agree with that.
All right, but the photographs would certainly document the fenced-in area, correct?
Correct.
And so was that area, fence to fence, north to south, east to west, was that examined by you or any of your colleagues?
Most of what was examined would have to be discussed with the people who examined it. I don't want to speak for them out of turn, but that is where the general focus was, and that is where they were. Captain Neal stood by with them while they were doing that.
All right. You're the one that wrote the investigative summary in this case, is that correct?
I did.
And would you tell the jurors who those people are that you relied on, the names of those people who did the search on the interior of the lot?
That would be Jamie Johnson and Al Brown.
And so based on what your recollection is and your oversight of the case, those are the two responsible for the search?
Correct.
Was that a line search, a grid search, a spiral search? What type of search was that?
I don't know exactly how they searched.
But it was searched.
Again, I don't want to speak for someone else. The area was checked by them. I can't give you particulars of exactly where they were in that lot. I was not present the entire time that they were conducting their search.
And of course, you've been sitting in the courtroom just like the jury has during the testimony of both those people.
Yes.
And did you oversee the collection of evidence by either Mr. Brown or Ms. Johnson?
Do I or did I?
Did you?
No.
So the collection of evidence then would have been their decision, not yours?
We can make suggestions and we will collaboratively discuss things, but ultimately we rely on the experts in their field to make those decisions.
Well, did you participate at the end of the investigation to close down the crime scene and to move on to other investigations?
Can you restate the question, please?
Yes, were you present when the crime scene was closed down? When all the work had been done, were you present then?
I believe I was I left the scene to go to the warehouse where the vehicles were being searched.
So if the crime scene was left prematurely, you would not have been involved in that?
If I left the crime scene prematurely?
If any law enforcement agents of any law enforcement agency left the crime scene with the understanding that the investigation was complete, you were not involved in that. Is that correct?
I believe when they were finishing up, I was at the warehouse.
So the answer is you were not involved in that.
I wouldn't say I'm not involved in that. We're communicating by phone, we're talking to each other, so I guess that would depend upon, and I'm not trying to be difficult, but what your definition of involvement would be.
Well, let me perhaps better phrase it. Did you suggest before returning to Columbia or wherever the folks were from that day, additional evidence gathering?
After we finished,
After 3 o'clock that afternoon?
several days later, yes.
But on April 4th, did you suggest any further investigation?
Not specific to what the crime scene agents did.
All right, well, at that time, at 3 o'clock on April 4th, everybody knew that there was a missing prom. Is that correct?
I don't know that everybody knew, but I know that there was an awareness that there was a prong that was missing, yes.
And the prom would have been and remains a critical piece of evidence in this case. Isn't that correct?
It could be.
The prong, if examined, like the other 3 prongs, you can tell whether or not electricity passed through that prong by a visual examination of the prong. Isn't that correct?
I wouldn't be able to testify to that. I'm not expert in that field. I've done my best to learn what I can about it, but
How many times have you personally talked to Taser International and the employees of Taser International?
I don't know the exact number, but a few.
And on any of those occasions, did you ask them whether or not it can be, to a certainty, if you examine the prong, to tell whether or not electricity passed through?
I don't believe I asked them that specific question. Our conversation was more about the time drift, the trigger activations, and the overall working of the taser with that particular model.
So you would agree, though, today that whether or not electricity passed through any of the wiring or the prongs would be critical for this jury to judge whether or not Mr. Scott had been tased effectively with the taser that day. Is that correct?
Your Honor, I believe this goes beyond what she says. She has no expertise in this.
Sustain the objection.
You're the case agent in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
You have said that Mr. Slager was interviewed by you on April 7th.
Correct.
And in that interview, you said that Mr. Slager said that his first taser, he believed to have hit Mr. Scott. Is that correct?
He believed that one of the prongs hit Mr. Scott and the other one did not.
And to test his reliability and his recall, I'm sure that that prong was examined, was it?
It was not, him being 5 years certified and being trained, didn't question his knowledge of that, being that there was nothing that it did not cause any type of neuromuscular incapacitation, according to what Mr. Slager told us.
Again, in assessing his recall that day, was there any verification that he was correct in saying that he hit Mr. Scott with one of the prongs?
One prong was located in Mr. Scott's upper left back.
From the first taser deployment, Mr. Slager on April 7th said on the first taser deployment, he hit Mr. Scott with one of the prongs, did he not?
Correct.
Have you tested his recall by looking to see whether or not, in fact, that was correct?
As I said, there was one in his back.
How many times was the taser used?
According to
You.
my understanding from Mr. Childs, based on what my understanding is from what he told me, I don't know that that can be determined, because my understanding is that there are 5-second bursts, and even if you hold the trigger down longer than that, my understanding from him is that it will show as another activation. So you may have multiple line items showing as an activation on that day, but in that particular model, my understanding from him, and again, I'm not the expert here, but my understanding was that you wouldn't be able to definitively say that they were all separate trigger pulls. So I can't definitively tell you that.
Based on your interview of Mr. Slager, based on your evidence collected at the scene, based on your communications with Taser, how many prongs were deployed that day for Mr. Slager's taser?
4.
How many were collected by
3.
Slager? And do we know whether the first deployment by Mr. Slager hit its target?
According to
Your investigation.
there was a prong in his back. Trying to differentiate which was which, I don't believe that I'm in a position to do that.
You've been in the courtroom the last 2 weeks, correct?
Yes, I have.
And you know that there are serial numbers associated with the deployment of the taser, correct?
There are serial numbers not associated with the prongs, but with the confetti,
And that's
the aphids.
And that's also the same serial number that's on the cartridge, correct?
Correct.
And we can, by not being an expert, which is in human nature, if Mr. Scott had dragged one of the cartridges with him, we could assume, could we not, that that was the cartridge that was attached to the prong, which was attached to his back?
You can always assume, but science would be better at answering that definitively.
Science being there's a prong in his back and there's a cartridge at his feet, we can't connect the two? How would the
And
cartridge
it would
be-
depend upon, you're trying to connect a prong to a cartridge, which the prongs do not have a serial number to connect that. So when you have movement in a scene, you can't definitively say exactly where that came from. You can assume, but you cannot definitively say that. Because if you have movement, and if he's dragging a cartridge I can't tell you definitively what prong came from what cartridge. I can give you anyone can give you their best assessment, but I can't tell you definitively.
Fair enough. How many prongs of the 4 prongs hit Mr. Scott?
Based upon,
Your investigation.
I believe, 3.
Hit Mr. Scott?
There was 1 prong in his back. The second deployment achieved the neuromuscular incapacitation, which was when he fell, which meant that a circuit had to be completed, which meant that there would have to be 2 prongs that made connection.
And what evidence is there of that at all?
The fact that he fell and was incapacitated,
Do you think he might have tripped?
I do not.
Do you think he might have gotten down on his own so that he could turn around and face Mr. Slager?
I do not.
So you just assume,
No, I didn't
without
assume.
any evidence at all, no examination to see if there was an electrical connection, no listening to the testimony of Dr. Tormos where there wasn't any evidence other than 1 prong hitting him. You just discard that and assume that he was hit.
I don't assume. Again, Mr. Slager, who gave us his version of the events, told us that at the second deployment, he knew that the connection was formed because Mr. Scott fell and the neuromuscular incapacitation occurred. Again, I would love to be able to tell you a lot of things definitively because that's the way my brain works. But unfortunately, in this situation, we don't have that as a definitive.
No question whether you're an expert or you're not an expert, you now know, based on your conversations with Taser International and your research on this, that you can tell whether electrical connection was completed or not by examination of the evidence.
Can you restate the question, please?
Let me preface it by saying this. You have assumed that there was a completed circuit. Is that correct?
I have not assumed. I was told by Mr. Slager.
But you've also told the jury that Mr. Slager didn't tell you the complete story of what happened that day.
You're
that
talking
correct?
about 2 different things.
It's Mr. Slager's statement. Was he correct? That was my question about the first taser hitting him, the second taser hitting him, or was he confused about what he was telling you that day? That's my question.
You would have to pose that question to Mr. Slager.
And what evidence do you have that there was a completed circuit that day?
We have the cartridge deployments. We have the aphids. We have the 3 taser prongs. We have the statement by Mr. Slager that he was incapacitated.
And as a result of your assumption, you had those 3 prongs examined for DNA, correct?
There was a wire examined for DNA and a prong. And I would have to refer back to,
Well, if you refer back to your notes, you'll see that the prongs that were found on the ground had no DNA on them. Isn't that correct?
I would refer back to confirm that.
I'll go right ahead.
No DNA was developed.
Are you familiar with the autopsy report of Dr. Tormos?
Yes,
And you were here when she testified the other day.
yes,
And she said there was only one prong, there was only one mark in which your prong connected with Mr. Scott. Is that correct?
correct.
So would it be fair to say there is nothing but your assumption, no evidence to support that assumption, that an electric circuit was completed that day?
With the exception of Mr. Slager's statement.
Which may be based on his involvement and his perception of what was going on that day, correct?
I believe it would be based on his training and experience and his knowledge of TASER and his certification and training of such.
Well, you wanted to verify what he said, so you did further testing to see whether or not there was anything to support what he said. That's the purpose of having the DNA on the prongs, correct?
Correct.
Now, where we left off before we got sidetracked was the examination of the evidence as seen that day. When the scene was broken down by SLED, SLED was aware that, or NCPD, whoever, that one of the prongs was missing.
Correct.
What effort did you know of, or what effort was supervised to find that prong? What was used to find that prong?
I could not answer that.
Was there a metal detector used at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
Was there a line search for that?
Again, I would have to ask you to speak with the agents who conducted that search.
Was there a grid search for? Ma'am?
I would have to direct you to those agents who conducted the search.
Were there bullets missing that day when you abandoned the scene, when you closed the scene?
Not that we were aware of
Not
at that, go
Sorry.
ahead,
I'm sorry, not that you were aware of what?
at that moment.
Because nobody looked. That's why you weren't aware, correct?
I can't answer that.
Well, you eventually saw when it was pointed out to you where the bullets were, you saw how easily they were to find, correct?
I didn't see how easily they were to find, but I was told that they were located by your investigators, and we came back to the scene and had our crime scene agents come back.
And at that time, you saw there was a very visible hole in the fence, a couple of holes in the fence.
There were holes in the fence.
Not hidden.
No.
And it was at that time you decided that you should take aerial photographs of the crime scene. Is that correct?
That was suggested by another agent, yes.
And they were taken?
Correct.
And that would be to provide the jury one day with an overall view of the scene, is that correct?
Correct.
And measurements were important to you that day as well as they would be to the jury?
Correct.
And so you measured the distance from Mr. Scott's car and Officer Slager's unit to the front of the yellow brick road where it intersected with Craig Street, correct?
I didn't measure, no.
Would that be important for the jury to know how far this chase took place, how tired, how exhausted Officer Slager may have been?
Again, I rely on the experts in that field to conduct their examination of the crime scene.
Well, you've been sitting...
I can't tell you what the jury feels would be important to them.
You've been sitting in the courtroom for 2 weeks, and you've heard the testimony, and you heard that there was a question about the distance?
Correct.
Any time in the last 2 weeks, did you go back out and measure the distance?
The distance from where?
From where Mr. Scott's car was until where Yellow Brick Road intersects with Craig Street?
No, I wouldn't be the one to do that.
Has anybody done that?
Not that I'm aware of.
And how far was it from the intersection of Craig Street and Yellow Brick Road to where the fight took place?
I would be guessing, and I'm not good at guessing a measurement.
But it would be important to know to determine how tired and exhausting the two parties were at the time they got into that scuffle, as you call it. Correct?
It could be, yes.
And if Mr. Santana said that he observed a fellow in a green shirt, I'm referring to the case agent herself,
I understand
the
that.
chief agent.
I'm sorry?
The chief agent, correct?
No.
You're the case agent?
I am a case agent.
And you don't know that distance?
I do not know the exact distance,
You
no.
don't know, and you can't tell the jury for their assessment of the credibility of Mr. Santana, whether or not he could have even seen as he claimed he saw. Correct?
I cannot at this time.
Because there was an assumption made that he could. Isn't that correct?
That's not correct.
Well, was it an assumption made that he could?
He videoed it.
When he first saw the fellow in the green shirt running down the street, he videotaped that?
No. He videoed the struggle in the lot.
Question was, has an assumption been made that he could see from where he first claims he saw Mr. Scott? Could he have done that?
I don't think it's an assumption. He was there, and what he has said has been consistent with what we've been told.
Now, to eliminate any assumptions, did SLED return to the crime scene to investigate it further?
Yes.
On what date?
I believe it was the 20th of April.
And what did SLED do on the 20th of April to assist this jury in understanding the facts and circumstances of this event?
I requested that they go over the crime scene basically with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that nothing had been missed, and to spend as much time as we needed to make that determination.
This was 16 days, over 2 weeks later?
Correct.
Was there a reason why SLED couldn't marshal its forces and use the sheriff's office or the North Charleston Police Department or any other law enforcement to do that on the 5th of April, the 6th of April, the 7th of April, the 8th of April, the 9th of April, the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th?
They went out there after we were contacted in reference to the 2 bullets.
And the only reason you went back out there is because Mr. Slager's defense team found credible material, specific evidence that was still there weeks later.
That is the reason we went that day, yes.
And if it hadn't been for that, you would never have gone back.
We've been back several times.
And tell the jury about the use of the Faro scanner, what that did, why that was employed. I understand it wasn't employed on April 4th because it's a very valuable piece of equipment and could have been damaged by the rain that day. So did you go back the next day with the Faro scan?
No. I actually, initially, after everything happened, I was trying to find out a way where we could put everything together to include the video, to include the radio transmissions, to include everybody's arrival and everybody's activity to get a clear idea of what happened that day. I was told that that could be done at a later time, possibly through experts that the solicitor may use. I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yes, was a Faro scan ever utilized by SLED so that this jury could judge time and distance.
So then I found out about the FARO-scan capability that we possibly had, but I was told that it was something that was a newer thing. So we were trying to determine if we could use it to begin with, and also if FBI, who also had the capability, had better capability for accuracy or more experience in using that. We discussed it. I spoke to Al Brown that day on the 20th that the initial start of the scans were done, and I had told him that I did not want to do the FARO scans that day because we hadn't made a final determination.
So the FARO scan wasn't used on the 4th because it was a threat of rain, is that correct?
I can't answer to that because I don't control anything with the FARO
But
scan.
you were in court when Mr. Brown testified, correct?
Correct.
And it wasn't used on the 5th through the 20th, for what reason?
I can't, you'd have to ask the lab that
And it
question.
was used on the 20th so that it could employ a accurate and exact measurements of the various pieces of evidence and where they were found. Is that correct?
That was the point of using it on any date.
I'm talking about
But
the
to
20th.
prioritize, and I understand that, but to prioritize that day, I was more concerned about the crime scene and being sure that we were thorough and that there was nothing that was missed, and going back over the crime scene.
The
So
20th
the FARO scan was not a priority that day.
The 20th was the day that SLED responded to the crime scene because Mrs. Slager's investigators had found the missing bullets, correct?
Correct.
And on that day, the FARO scan was brought to the location and was used at the location to help the jury understand the distances involved. Is that correct?
That was the intent,
And
but it
Mr.
did not, we did not do it that day.
And Mr. Talon is the SLED agent who's in charge of deploying or utilizing the FARO scan for the purpose of the jury's review. Is that correct?
He did handle it, yes.
And Mr. Talon started using the FARO scan and had gone through at least one scan of the area that day, April 20th. Is that correct?
My understanding from him is that he had not completed the scan. When I came on scene, I have never even seen a FARO scan done. So when I came on scene, there was a tripod and he was standing there, and I asked him if that was the FARO scan, and he said yes. And I said, I didn't think we were doing that. We weren't sure who was going to do it yet. We hadn't made that decision, and I wanted to focus on the crime scene.
But the
I
FARO
asked him if he could hold off on the FARO scan.
But the
when-
FARO scan actually documents the crime scene, correct? With precise measurements, it's computerized, laser beam, correct?
I cannot tell you exactly if it's precise measurements. You would have to talk to Agent Talon about that.
Well, in June, after this incident was over, did you go to a school that taught you about how beneficial a laser scan would be of the area?
I don't recall FARO scan being discussed.
But you, without any knowledge of how a FARO scan worked, without any knowledge of a homicide investigation by training, you're the one that instructed him to shut it down, turn it off, and destroy what had been done.
No, that's not correct.
Did you tell him to stop the FARO scan?
I asked him if he could hold off because I had already had a conversation with the lead crime scene investigator, Al Brown, that day in reference to the FARO scanning, and we made it very clear with each other that that was not going to be a priority. He said, well, they already have it loaded in the car. I said, okay, I just don't want any issues, and I want to make sure that we focus on the crime scene. He said he would make sure that he conveyed that. I was confused when I got on the scene as to why they were doing it, because I was thinking that they would be exactly what you're talking about, searching the scene to make sure that nothing was missed. So I asked him if he could hold off. I didn't ask him to destroy anything. What he advised me is that the scan does not complete. Therefore, when you asked us for that data, he advised that it could not be provided because the Faro scan did not complete. Therefore, it did not exist, so there was nothing to delete. Again, I am speaking upon what my understanding is from him, and he is the expert in that, so I think it would be better revisited with him, but that was what was conveyed to me.
So you would like us to ask Mr. Talon what happened that day? He'd be
No,
the best
I would
person.
like you to ask Mr. Talon, you don't have to ask anything, but if you're asking for clarification, and if you're asking if something was destroyed, I'm telling you that my understanding is that nothing was destroyed, and that he is more of an expert to speak on the workings of the Faro. All I'm doing is repeating to you what I've learned and what's been conveyed to me.
Well, since the 20th of April of 2015, has a Faro scan been deployed, and did it complete its process at the crime scene?
Since the 21st, can you repeat that, please?
Has the Faro been used to investigate this case so that the jury can see the benefit of what the Faro scan would show?
Yes.
And what date was that?
I believe they came back a couple days later. I don't recall the exact date.
And who came back a couple of days later?
Agent Talon and Agent Jamie Johnson
And were you present?
for a portion of it, yes.
And so you know that the Faro scan was utilized and completed its work to identify times, places, and distances of the evidence which was collected. Is that correct?
Yes, however, I was told that the measurements cannot be exact.
What measurements were those that are not exact?
You would have to speak to Agent Talon.
And this computerized machinery was not as effective as the eyesight and laser beams that Mr. Brown used?
Again, I make suggestions, and I am not the expert in that field.
So not being an expert in the field, you called upon Taser International to assist you so that the jury could get the benefit of their expertise in the examination of the taser. Is that correct?
I consulted with my supervisors and then contacted Taser International.
And that was in September. Is that correct?
I first spoke to him, I believe, in August.
And you spoke to him about examining the taser to see how the battery was and whether it was working properly on April 4th.
I don't
Is that
recall
correct?
specifically stating battery, but the overall workings of the taser.
And that was on September what date, ma'am?
What?
When did you decide to ship the taser to Taser International?
I did not make that decision. The letter was drafted on September 8th, and information was communicated to the lab because it was going to have to be sent from the lab, and the lab then sent it out.
On what date?
I believe it was either the 9th or the 10th.
And you were in court with this judge and all the people who are inside the bar on September 11th. Is that correct?
I don't recall the date. You'd have to specify what hearing that was.
The hearing on September 11th before the taser reached the laboratory in Scottsdale, Arizona.
What was discussed in that hearing?
You were instructed by this court on that date not to do anything with that taser that could destroy any evidence. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that specifically, but I do know after it was brought to our attention that there was concern about the taser being sent out, which was all arranged prior to that hearing, then I did speak with the solicitor approximately a month later when you brought up the issue to find out what was in the transcript and if an actual court order was made. And I also asked if that's something that is put in writing, in paper, or how that was made.
So let me understand. So if Mr. Slager makes a statement in oral statement, it's okay, but if the judge makes a statement orally...
It's not what I'm saying.
It's not okay.
It's not what I'm saying. I'm
Well,
saying
on
that...
September 11th, did you hear the judge order that the evidence in this case is to be preserved and not destroyed, or should any destructive testing be made of any evidence until such time as the attorney representing Mr. Slager can be advised and make an appropriate application to the court if need be? And did you hear Ms. Wilson say that she didn't object to that, and the court then said it is so ordered?
I
You were
did-
in court that day.
I was in court, but I did not. I had to have a conversation with Ms. Wilson, the solicitor, to determine that. We had already made those arrangements. We started that in August. The taser had already been examined by the lab, had been swabbed, and it was then sent to Taser International.
The taser wasn't photographed before it was sent to Taser International, was it?
Not to my knowledge.
The taser was not examined for trace evidence before it was sent to Taser International, was it?
It was not.
And you were ordered by this court not to do any or allow any destructive testing of that taser before it was examined by Taser International. Isn't that correct?
Again, at the time, the taser had already been sent out. I did not realize yes, I was here, but there's times that we're having different conversations. I spoke, it was of concern. When the solicitor asked about that, I asked her if she recalled that agreement. She went back into the transcript and found that that agreement had been made.
And she told you that when?
I don't know the exact date, but I could get that for you.
Was that the date you picked up the phone and called Taser and said, stop?
I didn't pick up the phone and call Taser and tell them to stop.
But at some point in time, you knew from the solicitor's advice to you that this court had ordered that no destructive testing should take place.
And I believe that that conversation, again, I don't know the exact date, but I believe that that confirmation with Solicitor Wilson was in November. The taser was examined in October.
And the court issued its order in September.
Correct.
Did you or anybody from SLED or anyone else call out there and say, don't destroy the trace evidence on this taser until we have a time to photograph it, to examine it?
It was not anything that crossed my mind until it was brought up as an issue. And again, it had already been swabbed. So the argument could be made that trace would have already been interrupted.
You've seen the taser, you're familiar with the taser.
Yes.
And you're familiar with the, as I said, the business end of the taser. Correct? Say hot, cold. You're familiar with 49, correct?
Yes.
And are you familiar with the electrodes on 49?
Being the two metal points.
Are you familiar with that?
If that's what you're referring to, yes.
And that's the area where there's an electrical transmission from one side to the other side?
That is my understanding.
And no question that trace evidence could be found there, correct?
You, again, I would need you to speak with the lab in reference to that.
No question that trace evidence was found there, correct?
There was a fiber that was found after it was shipped, or while it was at Taser International. Or, I'm sorry, there was a fiber that was found in your examination.
I didn't examine
The examination that you requested.
it. And that was done in the presence of SLED, is that correct?
Correct.
And there was trace evidence on that taser, correct?
I believe you would need to speak with Megan Fletcher about that.
She works for SLED. She's part of your investigation. She was present when trace evidence was found on the taser, correct?
I don't know who was sent to watch that examination.
Did you know that trace evidence that was found on that taser, the only trace evidence did not match up in this case?
The fiber?
Yes.
Yes.
And do we know that's because it wasn't a cotton fiber?
Again, I would have to refer you to the details of that to the person who conducted that exam.
And do we know what trace evidence would have been burned up in the testing of the taser by Taser International?
I cannot testify to that.
On April 4th, were you responsible for instructing the agents who were responsible for gathering evidence? Did you provide them with instructions as what to gather?
No.
After April 4th, did you provide them with instructions of what to gather?
It depends upon what you're talking about. Specifically, I had conversations about testing of the clothing, what tests could be done to determine any burn marks or picks or any type of defects with Wendy Bell. I also discussed IR photography with them.
Well, let's start with the evidence that was collected on April 4th from Officer Slager at the North Charleston Police Department. Was his duty belt collected that day?
It was not.
Did you know that day?
Yes, I requested that it be collected.
And when was it collected?
It was collected, I believe, on the 10th, but approximately.
And what was the purpose of collecting that?
At the time that I requested the duty belt, I was interested in the placement of his equipment and what equipment he had. I had not spoken with him yet, with Mr. Slager, and so I requested that crime scene secure the duty belt.
Well, actually, you spoke to him on April 7th, did you not?
Yes.
And so what day was the order given to collect the duty belt?
I requested it on April 4th.
On April 4th?
Yes.
When was it collected?
On April 10th.
So you asked for it to be collected and it wasn't collected for over a week?
Correct.
And what was the purpose of collecting it?
What I said
And what is that?
for me at the time, when I asked on April 4th, was I was interested in the equipment and the placement of his equipment, depending upon what we were being told happened between him and Mr. Scott.
So on April 4th, you knew that Officer Slager had given his recollection of the events on April 4th, correct?
I know that he spoke to some officers, but my interviews of officers were conducted after that day.
But you knew that he had spoken to officers, including the chief of police that day. You may
trying to
refresh your
remember.
memory at any time with your notes, if I'm confusing you.
I believe that he did talk to the chief. I believe that that was relayed to me by Captain Neal.
And is Captain Neal still with SLED?
Yes.
And once the items were collected from the duty belt, I assume that you asked for them to be collected for evidentiary value, correct?
At the time, it was, again, when I asked for them to be collected, I was interested in the equipment and the placement of his equipment on his belt.
So that the jury could understand that.
Correct.
And if there was any forensic examination done of the belt, then that could contribute to the jury's decision in this case, correct?
Any examinations could contribute, yes.
And what examinations, once you got the duty belt, what examinations did you request?
I did not request a forensic examination on the duty belt.
And since that belt has been in the custody of SLED for the past 18 months, how many examinations have been conducted on that belt?
I believe a visual examination, but I don't know of any forensic examinations.
Of any of the contents of the belt?
I don't believe so.
And on that belt, did it have a holster where the Glock weapon was kept?
Yes.
And what examination have you, or any of the agents of SLED, or any experts or specialists taken of that holster?
I have not conducted an examination of the holster.
So how long the holster that Officer Slager was using that day, how long would it take to extract his weapon from that holster?
That would depend upon the person pulling the weapon and what type of a holster.
And what type of holster is it?
I don't know what threat level it is.
Has that holster now been taken out of service? Not his, but all of it.
I do not know that.
You're not aware of whether or not the city of North Charleston no longer uses the type of holster that Officer Slager was carrying on April 4th?
I am not.
Would it be important to know if there was an impediment in that type of holster to remove the weapon?
Your Honor, she's already said she had no information of this. This is assuming facts.
Objection sustained.
You assume that Mr. Scott ran away because he had a bench warrant?
I can't tell you exactly why he ran away.
Because you don't know why he ran away.
His son believed that it was because of the bench warrant.
And because of that, that's been incorporated into the narrative of this incident that he was running so as not to go to, as the solicitor described it, debtor's prison. Is that correct?
I can't answer for the solicitor.
Well, you've introduced a document that I believe, or ID'd in a document that was a bench warrant from the family court.
Correct.
And could you explain to the jury the difference between a bench warrant and an arrest warrant?
The bench warrant is because he did not comply with whatever the court ordered him to do, which would be to pay the outstanding child support.
And an arrest warrant?
Would be, basically, the bench warrant is because he didn't comply with the court's order.
And on a bench warrant, are you familiar with the person who's brought immediately before a judge?
I'm sorry?
Are you familiar that on a bench warrant, the person who's picked up is brought immediately before a judge at the very first opportunity?
At the first opportunity.
And that they are offered an opportunity to give an explanation and what efforts they have made based on their salary and their commitments to their children?
Your Honor, he's testifying.
I'm asking a question of you, if you know how a bench warrant is responded to by the issuing court. Are you aware of that?
It depends upon what the judge has ordered.
It depends upon whether or not the person makes an effort of any type to comply with the instructions of the court. Is that correct?
Correct.
It doesn't mean that somebody's going to go to prison, whether it's jail or whether it's debtor's prison. That's up to the individual. Is that correct?
Not always. It depends upon if the judge says, pay this, or you have so many days in prison.
Do you know if the orders always say defendant may purge himself or herself of contempt and be released from confinement by at least attempting to follow the instructions of the court? Do you know that?
Again, my understanding is the ultimate decision is the judge.
Now, with respect to other issues of this case, we've heard earlier that SLED has a very fine laboratory in Columbia, employs over 100 people in the lab. Is that correct?
I don't know how many people are employed in the lab, but there are many people employed in the lab.
And they perform all sorts of forensic testing on evidence?
Correct.
Was there any forensic testing on the Yellow Brick Road paint?
No.
Did SLED have in its laboratory an exemplar of the Yellow Brick Road paint to compare it to other pieces of evidence in the case?
My understanding is there was some on Walter Scott's phone.
Was there ever a comparison made?
Not to my knowledge.
Was there ever a comparison made to the taser?
Not to my knowledge.
Was there ever any measurements taken of the taser wire to see whether it was complete or not?
Not to my knowledge.
Was there any examination of the taser wire to see whether or not there was any circuitry employed that day?
Not to my knowledge.
Was there ever an examination of Officer Slager's clothing that day? The day that, the clothing he wore on April 4th. Was there an examination of his clothing?
Yes.
And did that include obtaining a DNA exemplar?
Yes.
And was there any other examination of the clothing performed by SLED?
My understanding is there was a visual examination done, and later there was IR photography done.
Do you know whether or not the SLED laboratory attempted to do an ultraviolet light examination of the clothing?
I do not know what all light sources they used. I know that they did discuss different light sources.
Do you know whether a lab analyst in her examination of the clothing was instructed by you to stop the examination?
No.
And so if there's a laboratory report that you called up there and told them to stop further examination of the clothing, that would be untrue.
I can't say that would be, well, it would be untrue. I don't recall saying that. The only thing that I know would have, that could have came from was the court order, and my understanding is that Major Huey advised everyone to stop testing at one point until agreements were made within the court.
would you deny that on January 22nd of 2016, that you called analyst Verona T. Herrera and instructed her not to do any further testing?
I do not recall that.
You don't deny that?
I can't deny, I don't recall it.
And you know that that type of testing with a light is not a destructive testing as was done by Taser International, isn't that correct?
I have no recollection of that.
And that no further sero, I guess that stands for serology, examination was conducted and the administrative review was closed on January 22nd.
I believe that came again from Major Huey.
Yet you know that Mr. Williams and Mr. Thompson, sent there by the solicitor's office, was able to review the evidence on January 7th. Is that correct?
Can you repeat that, please?
You know that Mr. Williams and Mr. Thompson, experts with the solicitor's office, they were able to review that evidence and examine it and test it and measure it on January 7th of 2016.
I don't know what all they did.
Were you present?
Where was this?
I don't know. Where do you all keep your evidence?
What I can tell you, sir, is that what the lab did and what was going on with the lab was conducted by the lab. I cannot tell you specific dates of what was done and who did what. You would have to speak to them. I was not, at one point, there was communication between the solicitor's office and the lab and all the requests that you were making, and all those things were happening with them.
And you're just not familiar with that. Is that correct?
I'm familiar with some things, but I'm not familiar with everything, no.
You're familiar with when Mr. Bellucci from my office went to SLED on August 12th, he was prohibited from photographing Mr. Slager's shirt and pants. You were present that day.
I was present, yes.
And he was prohibited from photographing that evidence, correct?
Again, a lot of what you're asking me is actions of other people. My understanding was that they had decided prior to coming what was going to be examined and what the procedures were going to be. And then one of the individuals in the lab said that they were welcome to do that, but that they would have to make arrangements and an agreement prior to doing it, and that they would have to come back to do that.
To photograph.
I don't know exactly what he was doing. I know he was using different types of lenses, but yes, it included photography.
And speaking of different types of lenses, do you know whether or not the state laboratory used different types of lenses to evaluate the clothing?
Eventually, I believe that they did. Initially, when I asked that, they said that they didn't have the proper lighting to do it.
And do you know, since they've had the proper lighting, they've taken over 1,000 photographs of the shirt and pants?
I didn't know it was over 1,000.
You don't dispute that, do you?
I don't know how many.
1,031.
Okay.
And that was done for evidentiary purposes? To tell the jury what they found when they photographed it?
Correct.
And then you know that there have been further microscopic examinations by SLED looking for forensic evidence of Mr. Slager's shirt being burned by an electrical current. Is that correct?
That came to my attention in the end of October
Of what year?
this year,
Well, that's when the trial started. October 31st.
during the meeting that you were present for about a week before the trial started.
And that's when, after 18 months, you first became aware that SLED had examined the clothing for electrical burnings. And of course, they found it, didn't they?
They visually examined for electrical burns prior to that, is my understanding. What they did, I was not a part of it. I wasn't aware of it until the meeting that day, when I found out that there was going to be a meeting. And that is when I became aware of what they were doing.
In fact, SLED had been conducting experiments from October of 2015, in January of 2016, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, and didn't even tell the solicitor. Isn't that correct?
You would need to speak with them.
Evidence of the clothing of Mr. Slager, critical evidence in this case, was not even told to the solicitor. Isn't that correct?
I'm not sure what they told.
You were present at the meeting when I confronted him about it,
Correct.
and you knew then, if not before, that even the solicitor wasn't informed of the investigation by SLED.
I was actually informed of the meeting by the solicitor's office. I don't know what they knew before.
Now, let's go back to what is under your direct supervision. Mr. Santana's video would be that, correct? You interviewed personally Mr. Santana. You received from one of the members of the Scott family's attorneys, you received that video from them?
Correct.
And so you saw that video that night, and reviewed it with a bunch of other law enforcement folks the next morning?
Yes.
And you then interviewed Mr. Slager,
Myself and Lieutenant Ginn.
and in that interview, he told you that he could hear the clicking sound of the taser and knew that it hadn't connected and things of that nature, as you've testified previously.
Correct.
And then when did you take your notes and turn them into a typewritten statement? Your memorandum of interview. When did you compose your memorandum of interview from your notes?
I would have to look at the date. I don't know that date. It would,
Well, go right ahead.
I don't have that report up here, if you have a copy of it.
You don't have your report of the memorandum of interview?
No.
Would it be fair to say that there was your notes that you took, that you testified to the jury, and then at some later date you wrote up your recollection of Mr. Slager's statement by using your notes, is that correct?
Correct.
And then at a later date you wrote up an overall report of the whole investigation. Part of that would have been the interview with Mr. Slager.
Correct.
Please excuse my notes on this. I'm going to hand you two documents and ask you to identify them.
Thank you. This is my memorandum of interview of Michael Slager and a copy of the investigative report.
So the interview of Michael Slager was on what day?
April 7th.
And what day did you write up the report of your interview?
I don't know the exact date.
And what date did you write up your report of the investigation?
It's dated June 4th, but that would have been when it was finalized.
2 months later. And your notes taken from Mr. Slager on April 7th, he said he believes Scott was trying to use the taser on him being Slager, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And he was scared, he being Slager was scared.
Correct.
And he said, Slager, tried to get away and get up. Is that correct?
Correct.
He said, I believe he was trying to hit me with the taser. My goal was to get away from it. I was scared. That's what Officer Slager told you on April 7th. Correct?
Yes.
And then in your report you wrote, Scott tried to get up and get away and got up. In fact, you changed 180 degrees of what Mr. Slager told you about Slager being scared because the taser was being used against him, and inserted in your report to look like Scott was trying to get away from the taser. Isn't that correct?
Says he believes Scott was trying to use the taser on him and he was scared. Scott tried to get away and get up. He was winded, tired, breathing heavy, and in fear for his life. Scott got to his feet with the taser pointed at him.
That's in your report of June 4th. But in your notes from April 7th, Slager said that Scott was using the taser against him, and Slager, got up to try to get away from Scott and the taser.
It says Scott got to his feet with the taser pointed at him.
On April 4th, you interviewed Mr. Slager, correct?
I did.
And Mr. Slager said his goal was to get away from it being the taser held by Scott.
Correct.
So on April 7th, Slager said Slager was trying to get away from Scott who held the taser. And then on June 4th, you said that Scott was trying to get away from the taser held by Slager, just the opposite of what he had told you. Isn't that correct?
Can you point to me exactly what you're talking about?
Yes, it's the same thing that was pointed out to you by the solicitor. SAW 3 and SAW 1233. Do you have your notes in front of you?
I have the report.
You have your notes.
I do.
When you look at 1233 at the top of the page, I'm referring to 1233 as the solicitor's documentation.
I don't have 1233.
Do you have the notes of your interview with Mr. Slager?
Yes,
The solicitor has designated it by page number 1233.
it's not on these notes.
Could you link the solicitor's numbers up with your page numbers, please?
And you want me to refer where in the report?
I would like you to look at solicitor's page number 1233. I say that because your notes are not numbered, is that correct?
Correct.
Right, so
So this is 1233.
if you would look at the solicitor's bait stamp 1233. At the top of that page, did you write down, I believe he was trying to hit me with the taser?
Right?
Is that what Slager told you, that Scott was trying to hit him with the taser?
Correct?
And did he say my goal, that being Slager's goal, was to get away from it? I was scared.
Correct.
And then you went on and asked him about his other emotions of the moment, being frightened and whatnot.
Correct.
Including what was rapidly going through his mind in fear. Is that correct?
Right.
Hoping that he would get home that day.
Yes.
And then in your investigative report on Scott was trying to hit him with the taser?
Correct?
And did he say my goal, that being Slager's goal, was to get away from it? I was scared.
Correct.
And then you went on and asked him about his other emotions of the moment, being frightened and whatnot.
Correct.
Including what was rapidly going through his mind in fear. Is that correct?
Right.
Hoping that he would get home that day.
Yes.
And then in your investigative report on June 4th provided to the solicitor, you indicated that Scott tried to get away and got up. When actually your notes say that Slager was the one who was trying to get away.
This is a summary. I'm trying to see if in any other pages. I can't, it's a summary, it's in the notes, it says that he's continually coming forward at me with it. I believe I was trying to hit him with the taser, my goal was to get away from it, I was scared. The MOI is going to be a more comprehensive reflection. The report is a summary. Scott did try to get up and get away at one point.
But the summary doesn't reflect what Mr. Slager says, it reflects the opposite of what he said. Correct? Well, let's move on and talk about the Slager automobile. Did you scan that? You have that scanned?
It was searched by Al Brown.
How about the Mercedes?
I believe that was also searched by Al Brown.
Was there a weapon in Slager's unit ever found? Was there a weapon in it?
Not that I'm aware of.
And how about the inventory of Mr. Scott's vehicle? You have the inventory of that?
I don't have an inventory. There's a search warrant return.
And how many items are on the search warrant return?
I would have to see the search warrant return.
Well, there's the registration card, and there's the insurance card, or is there anything of substance in terms of tangible items?
I believe there was a set of keys. I believe there was a Phillips thumb drive.
But no inventory.
I don't believe that there was an inventory.
And how about Santana now? Did you say you took 4 or 5 interviews with him to get the story straight, or to get the story written down? What was the issue there? He had his attorney.
There were scheduling issues with him and his attorney.
And it took four times to meet with him?
Correct.
And you wrote down everything he said, and you actually went back to the scene with him, correct?
Correct.
And he told you what he heard that he wasn't able to record?
Right.
And he heard Officer Slager telling him, stop, stop? Is
I
that
do.
correct?
Correct.
And he heard him warn him about the taser?
I don't recall him.
And he heard about telling him to get on the ground? These are all critical matters in terms of what was in the mind of Officer Slager at the time he used lethal force, correct? We don't know how far he ran. Do we know how long the fight lasted?
Mr. Savage made a statement, then a number of statements, then you asked a question. You can't make statements, you must pose questions. Well, ask one question, not make a statement and then bracket it with a question. Ask her another question or the same question, but ensure that it is a question, not a statement.
It's important to know what was in Mr. Slager's mind at the time he used force. Is that correct?
It should be considered.
And we also find it important what his physical ability was at that time. Is that correct?
It goes into, it should be considered, yes.
And we should consider whether he called 156 in terms of what was in his mind at the time. Is that correct?
It can, I don't know what was in his mind at the time. Only he can explain that.
And you asked him specifically why he called 156. Is that correct?
Yes,
And he gave you an answer to that.
he did.
And his answer was he was the closest one there. I knew he would get there first.
Correct.
Isn't that correct? And you know that if he had been on his assigned route, how long would it take for him to get there at the longest?
I believe it took him 2 minutes.
If he was on his assigned route, you've gone back over his route, I'm sure, correct?
I know that it was a,
Speculation,
The objection's over.
Can you go back and look at where they were assigned to work that day?
my understanding is that they were in the same zone.
Did you go back and look at the route that they followed within their assigned zone that day
It's like a racetrack.
around Charleston Farms, is that correct?
Yes,
2 officers assigned to the exact same route.
correct.
And from the farthest distance in that route to the incident site, how long would it take?
I don't know.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
Court's indulgence. No, sir.
All right, you may step down and we'll take a break. Wait, let the jury exit. We'll take about 15 minutes. Please do not discuss the case. Step down. Is this your witness where you need 20 minutes, or?
No, I think in light of how long this took, that witness will have to start first thing in the morning. We might finish our tad early, but that will be our last witness.
All right, we'll be in recess 15 minutes.